In 1987, a family of four disappeared from a trailer in rural Illinois. What investigators found inside was so brutal that certain details were kept out of public record for years. Decades later, retired investigators still struggle to speak about that scene on record. The man who likely did it confessed. He was never charged. He died on a gurney in Texas for a different crime entirely. This is the story of the Dardeen family. Ina, Illinois sits in Jefferson County in the southern part of the state, far from Chicago, far from anything that generates national attention. It is the kind of town where the same families have lived on the same roads for 3 generations, where people know each other's trucks by sound, where a stranger's face gets noticed and then forgotten because strangers pass through and nothing ever comes of it. November arrives early there and settles hard into the flat fields. Keith Dardeen was 30 years old, a quiet handyman who fixed things and didn't make noise about it. His wife Elaine was 8 months pregnant with their second child. Their son Peter was 3 years old, a toddler who should have been safe in his own home, who had no reason in the world to be afraid. Keith had driven down to Ina from their home in Benton to look at a piece of land. He and Elaine had been talking about buying property for a while, wanting to build something permanent instead of renting, wanting to give their kids a yard that actually belonged to them. He was staying in a mobile home on the site for a few days while he looked things over. Elaine and Peter came with him. It was the kind of trip that doesn't get remembered because there's nothing to remember. A few days away, a look at some land, home by the weekend. Keith never came home. On November 18th, 1987, a local farmer noticed Keith's truck parked in the same spot it had been sitting for too long. He walked over, knocked, tried the handle. That scene became the point of reference for every horror that followed in Jefferson County. Something investigators carried with them long after they retired, something that still surfaces in interviews with the people who were there. For over 15 years, it had no name attached to it. Only a file for graves and questions no one could move past. Elaine Dardeen was found inside the mobile home. She had been struck repeatedly with a blunt instrument with a severity that made clinical language almost impossible for investigators to maintain in their reports. She was 8 months pregnant. The trauma forced her body into labor. She gave birth during or immediately after the attack. The newborn daughter would never leave that trailer. She became the 4th victim of a night that made no sense by any measure. 3-year-old Peter was found in the same home. He had not survived either. Keith was not inside. His body was discovered near Peter's station across the county line in Franklin County, a jurisdictional detail that would later complicate the investigation in ways no one anticipated. He had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm. Investigators also documented significant post-mortem trauma to his body, details they chose not to release publicly. The distance between Keith and the rest of his family was not random. Someone walked him out there deliberately, across that county line, and shot him separately from the others. For people dead, no robbery, no signs of a struggle at the door, none of the usual hallmarks of a break-in. Whatever came to that trailer on the night of November 17, 1987, it did not come for property. Jefferson County investigators worked the case hard in those first weeks. They canvassed the area thoroughly, interviewed everyone connected to the Dardeens, ran every lead available. One by one, those leads went cold. No fingerprints from the scene matched anyone in any database. No murder weapon was recovered. No one in the surrounding area remembered a stranger near the property. The .22 caliber bullet pulled from Keith's body matched nothing on record. The case had 4 victims and nowhere to go. They buried Elaine with the daughter she never got to hold. They buried Peter. They buried Keith. A family that had been planning a land purchase and a new baby was gone, and no one knew why, and no one knew who. White County, Jefferson County, Franklin County, multiple jurisdictions, 1 crime, 0 suspects. Law enforcement agencies in southern Illinois shared information, compared notes, and arrived at the same conclusion every time. Nothing. The physical evidence that existed was not enough to generate a name, and without a name, the investigation had no direction to move in. For nearly 12 years, the case aged in the files. Investigators came back to it when new forensic techniques became available, when new DNA databases came online in the mid-1990s, when cold case units started applying fresh eyes to old evidence. Each time, nothing broke. The Dardeen murders settled into Jefferson County's history as the case that couldn't be closed and couldn't be moved, an open wound that nobody had the evidence to treat, sitting in a drawer alongside the names of 4 people who deserved better. And here is something worth understanding about the geography of that 15-year silence. In the years between 1987 and 1999, across the rural American states, other families were also being destroyed. Other case files were also sitting in drawers in county sheriff's offices. Other names were also going unanswered. And the man investigators would eventually come to believe was responsible for the Dardeen murders was moving through all of it, through Texas, Missouri, California, West Virginia, Kentucky, leaving a trail that nobody connected because nobody knew there was a trail to connect. Then, January 1999. A 13-year-old girl named Crystal Searle survived having her throat cut in Del Rio, Texas. She dragged herself out of the house and to a neighbor's door. She gave police a description precise enough to produce an arrest within hours. The man arrested was Tommy Lynn Sells. He was charged with the capital murder of Crystal's friend Kayleen Harris, who had not survived. And then, sitting in a Texas cell, he started talking. Sells wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a man with no paper trail, moving through small towns where no one asked for an ID. He had been drifting since his teens, freight trains between rural towns, a few days of farm work or gas station work, gone before anyone thought to look twice. Born in 1964, he grew up in poverty and abuse, cycled through juvenile facilities, and learned early that if you never stayed anywhere long enough to matter, nobody would come looking for you. That was his entire system. It was a simple way to live, but for over 20 years, it worked. The scope of what investigators began to uncover after his arrest was staggering. Sells ultimately confessed to an estimated 70 or more murders across more than a dozen states. Some of those confessions were verified and held up against physical evidence. In 1987, the same year the Dardeens were killed, Sells is also believed to have been responsible for the murders of Joel and Lori Loveless in Missouri. In 1985, he confessed to the murder of a 4-year-old girl named Haley McGiver in California. In 1999, just months before his arrest in Del Rio, he killed 13-year-old Noelle Ojeda and her 9-year-old friend Mary B. Perez in a field in Texas. Case after case, state after state. A body count that stretched across 2 decades of unchecked movement through rural America. But other confessions fell apart completely. Sells would confess to anything for a headline, and investigators knew it. He claimed murders that timelines made impossible. He described crimes in states he demonstrably could not have been in on the dates he named. In at least several cases, DNA evidence from scenes directly excluded him. His credibility was genuinely complicated, and that fact is central to understanding how the Dardeen confession was received. Because when investigators weighed what Sells said about the Dardeens, that complicated credibility made the solid details even harder to dismiss. Sells said he had been in the Ina area in November 1987. He described the mobile home, the property layout. In his telling, Keith answered the door and invited him in, offered him a beer, and if that detail is true, it makes what followed a particular kind of betrayal on top of everything else. He described the attack. He acknowledged the birth of the baby. And then he described walking Keith out to the field afterward and shooting him there, across the county line, near Peters Station in Franklin County. That detail was never made public. Keith being found at that specific location separated from his family, with the implication he had been walked there rather than attacked at the trailer. That information existed only inside the case file. Sells produced it without prompting, without hesitation, without it being suggested to him. That is not something reconstructed from newspaper coverage. That is not something a person guesses. But Sells also said he arrived in a station wagon. Keith's truck was the only vehicle at the scene. Certain elements of his description of the trailer layout didn't align with the physical record. Those contradictions are real, documented, and acknowledged by investigators who studied the confession carefully. If you look at the full picture of what Sells got right and what he got wrong, you're not looking at a clean confession. You're looking at something that carries the weight of truth in exactly the places that matter and falls apart in the details that are harder to verify. While the forensics point towards Sells, the legal system was stuck. There simply wasn't enough to secure a conviction. No DNA from the scene had been preserved in usable form when retested with updated technology. His movements in November 1987 were consistent with his having been in the area, but consistent with is not the same as proven beyond reasonable doubt. The contradictions in the confession were exactly the material a defense attorney tears apart in front of a jury. Prosecutors need physical evidence that survives cross-examination. Here, it didn't exist. Sells was already on death row in Texas for Kayleen Harris's murder. He was going to be executed regardless of what happened in Illinois. Moving forward with charges in the Dardeens case without sufficient evidence to sustain them risked creating legal complications that could harm rather than help the family's cause. The decision was made not to charge him. The file stayed open. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection on April 3, 2014. He was 49 years old. He made no final statement that changed anything about the Dardeens case. Whatever he knew beyond what he had already said across 15 years of interviews, he took it with him. The families of his confirmed victims were present when he died. Crystal Searles watched it happen. For them, a door closed on something that had been open too long. For the people connected to the Dardeens, there was no equivalent moment. A man dying in Texas for a different crime while 4 graves in Jefferson County stayed without a verdict attached to them. It's easy to process a case this old as a sequence of facts, dates, calibers, county lines, a confession that didn't stick. But on November 17, 1987, Keith Dardeen was a 30-year-old man looking at a piece of land he wanted to buy. Elaine was 8 months along, probably already thinking about names for the baby. Peter was 3 years old and had no reason to be afraid. These were people in the middle of an ordinary week with ordinary plans, and by the following morning they were gone. Peter's toys, whatever they were. The name Elaine and Keith had probably already picked out. The land deal Keith had driven 2 hours to look at. None of that makes it into a case file. It exists only in the memories of people who loved these 4, and those memories have been carrying an unresolved weight for nearly 40 years. Elaine's family has spoken over the years about what it means to have a confession and no conviction, to have investigators who believe it, to have the man who likely did it die by lethal injection in a different state for a different victim. The grief that comes from that specific combination doesn't peak and recede. It occupies a permanent space in a way that clean resolution, a trial, a verdict, a sentence, might have made slightly more bearable or might not have. Nobody gets to find out. Keith Dardeen opened his door that night because that was what you did. A stranger knocked and he answered. In Sells' own account, he offered that stranger a beer. The forensic evidence points toward Sells. The legal system couldn't get across the line from probable to proven. Now both men are dead, one executed in Texas, one buried in Jefferson County. Keith, Elaine, Peter, a baby girl with no name because she never had time for one. Today, the case file for the Dardeen family murders sits in Jefferson County exactly where it has always sat. Open, officially unsolved, A four-victim homicide with a confessor who is dead and a conviction that never came. If you pull the record, that is what it says. Unsolved. After nearly 40 years, 2 states, 1 execution, and a confession that investigators believed and could not prove, the file still says the same word it said in 1987. Unsolved.